thing as privacy on the Internet. You've got a facility out here in Utah that's built by the NSA that is massive in scope, that probably has the capability of pretty much monitoring all communications traffic just about on planet Earth and storing that information indefinitely for whatever purposes they deem necessary. You also have
all of that conversation in our video library at cspan.org. We take you live to the House next. 19 bills up for debate, including a measure aimed at preventing misuse of government credit cards and a bill that would limit abortions in the District of Columbia for women pregnant more than 20 weeks.
The ayes and nays are ordered, or on which a vote incurs under objection to Clause 6 of Rule 20. Record votes will be postponed. Record votes on postponed questions will be taken later today. Clerk will report the bill.
Senate 679, an act to reduce the number of executive positions subject to Senate confirmation.
Sure. Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chavitz, and the gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Maloney, each will control 20 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks to include extraneous materials under the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
The need for reforms in the federal appointment process is not a new topic. There is little dispute that the current nominations process has grown too cumbersome and complicated, in some cases discouraging qualified individuals from seeking leadership positions. On average, in recent administrations, only 35 of the 100 most needed leadership roles were filled within the first 100 days of the new administration. 200 days into a new administration, only 50% of key national security officials are actually in place. 9 special commissions have called for fixing the broken presidential appointments process, starting with the presidential transition and personnel planning earlier, streamlining background investigations, and reducing the number of appointments requiring Senate confirmation. Senate Bill 679 provides a common-sense solution that preserves the important role of the Senate in confirming key nominees, but unburdens the process by relieving the advice and consent requirement for less critical positions. The bill is based on a bipartisan Senate working group commissioned to improve the nominations process, which was led by Senators Alexander and Schumer. Senate Bill 679 eliminates the requirement for Senate confirmation for a number of executive branch positions, many of which are 1, below the Assistant Secretary level and report to a Senate-confirmed individual, 2, do not make policy, or 3, are members of the part-time advisory boards or commissions. Senate Bill 679 also establishes an executive branch working group to study and report on the streamlining paperwork required for nominations. In addition, Senate Bill 679 requires a fixed 5-year term for the Director of the Census Bureau to coincide with the planning and operational phases of the census. The Director of the Census Bureau remains subject to Senate confirmation. Senate Bill 679 provides a mechanism to allow the Senate to focus its efforts on installing qualified leaders to key positions in order to meet the many challenges facing our nation. At this time, Mr. Speaker, I'll continue to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of S. 679, the Presidential Appointment Efficiency and Streamlining Act, which was introduced in the Senate by Senator Schumer and Alexander. This bill will improve the presidential appointment process by reducing the number of presidentially appointed positions that are required to be confirmed by the Senate. The number of presidentially appointed positions that require Senate confirmation has increased over the years. The Congressional Research Service estimates that at the beginning of the Obama administration, there were 1,215 executive branch positions subject to Senate confirmation. It takes months for a new president to fill these positions and make the resulting gaps in leadership makes the government less efficient and less productive. This bill will reduce the bureaucracy and red tape that comes with requiring the Senate to confirm presidential appointments. Under this bill, high-profile positions such as department secretaries and deputy secretaries will continue to require the consent of the Senate. This bill impacts lower-level positions, which a president routinely fills these positions without any controversy. For example, this bill would eliminate the Senate confirmation requirement for positions such as the alternate federal co-chairman of the Appalachian Regional Commission and members of the National Council on Disability. In addition to reforming the presidential appointments process, the legislation before us today makes the Director of the Census Bureau a presidential term appointment of 5 years, subject to confirmation by the Senate. I particularly am pleased the bill includes this provision so that the Director is tied to the needs of the decennial census and not to an election year calendar. For years I've been working on this provision, which I proposed in H.R. 4595 in the 111th Congress, to ensure the Census Bureau is able to perform the decennial census as accurately and as inexpensively as possible. Senator Carper introduced this bill in the Senate and added this amendment, this bill, to the bill we are considering today. Too often in the last 4 decennials, there have been major operations issues to overcome just before implementation. Historically, it's not uncommon for the Bureau to be without a director to lead the agency until shortly before the decennial. We did not have a director in place for the current 2010 count until mere months before the census day. In 2000, the census director took office 2 years before the decennial count, and in 1990, it was 1 week before the count. This change will help to ensure the independence of the Census Bureau from political interference and ensure adequate leadership for the census in critical planning and implementation phases for the decennial. Data and analysis from the Census Bureau provides policymakers, businesses, state and local governments with vital, accurate, scientific information that is used to guide our country's economic growth. It's important that Bureau leadership have stability. So I thank the Chairman and Ranking Members for getting this done. The Senate passed this bill with an overwhelming bipartisan majority. I believe this body should defer to the will of the Senate when it comes to their own process for confirming presidential appointments. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this good government bill. Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomes.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with due deference to my friend from New York and my friend from Utah, and I do mean that literally, I rise in opposition to this bill. What we've seen over the last year and a half is a presidency that had the most disdain for Congress and the confirmation process of any president I'm aware of, and I'm quite familiar with our history of the United States. Not only has this president made recess appointment when there was no recess, not only has this president appointed czars that were beyond the reach of Congress, although we could have made it within our reach. We could have just cut off every dime for anything that did not come before congressional approval. But with this latest tactic of having a recess appointment when there wasn't a recess, all of the talk across the country about the appointing of czars with no accountability to the Senate, I really did expect some of my conservative friends in the Senate at some point to move a bill on this subject, but I expected it to be a bill that would send a loud and clear message to the President that if you feel like some of these don't need to be appointed, you come talk to us about it, and let's talk about no more recess appointments. Let's talk about some of these others. Instead, it's almost a pat on the back to the President to say, look, you've ignored us, you've made us irrelevant, you've done all of these things through, as you've said, Congress won't act, so you're going to act. The President's gone out, made speeches, and as like a king or Caesar, as I speak, so it is the law. And even though Congress has duly passed immigration laws that the President has stood up, and as he spoke, he made law and ignored Congress completely, the message we're sending back here is, Mr. President, as in some old movie, thank you, may I have another. Look, you just keep ignoring us, and we'll keep making ourselves more and more irrelevant. I would like to make one other point, too. Here we are in a desperate situation where our military, our very national security, is at risk for being cut to the extent that we will no longer be secure. I would humbly submit that a better bill would be, Mr. President, if these are not all that important, let's get rid of all of these. There are board members, there's commissioners. I mean, there's things in here. There's a director of the Women's Bureau. I don't see one for the Men's Bureau. There's director of all kinds of things here that it just seems like are redundant, that could be done away with. If they're not important enough for the Senate to take a look at them, Mr. Speaker, I would humbly suggest that maybe they're irrelevant and immaterial enough that we just do away with the positions. And accordingly, I would urge colleagues to vote no on this provision.
Gentleman from New York.
Granting as much time as I may consume, I respectfully disagree with my good friend from the great state of Texas, Representative Gomart. The number of executive branch positions subject to Senate confirmation has grown at a very large number, and it literally takes months to fill these positions, and the resulting gaps in leadership makes the government less efficient and less productive. It came to us with a strong bipartisan vote in the Senate, and I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from Utah.
I yield myself such time as I may consume. Mr. Speaker, I will be under the general leave inserting a couple of letters. One is from Frank Carlucci, who is the former Secretary of Defense under President Reagan, who wrote us a letter that said, quote, leaving positions vacant indefinitely as appointees wait to be confirmed is not smart management and is frankly a threat to our national security, end quote. Also in support of this piece of legislation, noted conservative senator, former Senator Fred Thompson, who took a position on this and says, I believe this will result in an increasingly narrow pool of public servants who are more likely to be wealthy and already live in the Washington, D.C. area. That is, if we don't pass this piece of legislation. He went on to say in 1960, President Kennedy had 286 positions to fill the ranks of Secretary, Deputy Secretary, Undersecretary, Assistant Secretary, and Administrator. By the end of the Clinton administration, there were 914 positions with these titles. As was noted by the gentleman from Texas, there's an argument to say a lot of these positions shouldn't even be in the federal government. But nevertheless, under the Constitution says under the Article 2, Section 2, the Appointments Clause, I'll cut right to the phrase I'd like to refer to, which is, Congress may by law vest the appointments of such inferior officers as they think proper. Therefore, as I read the Constitution, we have a duty and a responsibility to review this and look at this. So here you have a situation where 79 senators, in a very bipartisan way, came together after 9 different commissions and looking at things and decided to trim it back a little bit. There will still be over 1,000 Senate-confirmed positions. But if we want proper oversight, if we want to go through this process in a swift and timely manner, if we want oversight, let's focus on what's most important. What's most important probably doesn't require Senate confirmation for the Assistant Secretaries for Public Affairs. How about the Administrator of St. Lawrence Seaway Development Corporation, or the National Council on Disability, or the Office of Navajo and Hopi Relocation? These are positions that, while are important to our nation, and some would argue are vital, probably don't necessarily rise to the level that requires Senate confirmation. These should not just be used as political tools. This nation has business at hand, and we should focus on what's important. Again, there are still more than 1,000 appointments that will require Senate confirmation. But let's listen to our colleagues in the Senate. 79 of them came to here and said, we think this is good. There have been 9 different commissions looking at this. I think it's a valid recommendation. It still allows for the advice and consent within the Senate. It is a duty under the Constitution to do this. And with that, I would encourage adoption. At this time, I'll continue to reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady has yielded back the balance of her time. Gentlelady has yielded back the balance of her time.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would encourage adoption of this. I think it's common sense. It's what our friends in the Senate are asking us to do with 79 79 senators coming together to urge the adoption of this. And with that, I'll yield back.
The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate Bill 679? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended. The bill is passed.
Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Texas.
I would ask that recorded vote be had for the yeas and nays.
Someone request the yeas and nays?
Yes.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those favor taking a vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. Sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20 and the Chair's prior announcement, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4365 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 4365, a bill to amend Title V United States Code to make clear that amounts in the Thrift Savings Fund are subject to certain federal tax levies.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chavez, and the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Maloney, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials under the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
I'd now like to actually yield such time as she may consume to the gentlewoman from New York, the prime sponsor and author of this piece of legislation, Ms. Burke.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Chairman for recognizing me. I rise today in support of my legislation, H.R. 4365, which would make thrift saving plans subject to federal tax levies. Currently, TSP accounts are not listed in the IRS code provisions identifying property that is exempt from tax. This bill makes clear that the TSP accounts are to be treated the same as 401ks and similar retirement and savings accounts held by private sector employees. This bill is about fairness, Mr. Speaker. It will treat federal employees the same as private sector employees. H.R. 4365 adds needed clarification to existing law and provides guidance to the Thrift Board on how to honor IRS levies as they arise. In 2010, the Office of Legal Counsel at the Department of Justice concluded that TSPs are subject to levy. And last week, the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board, which oversees TSP accounts, wrote Congress asking that this issue be clarified expeditiously, noting that the lack of clarity is causing significant operational issues. At the end of 2010, Mr. Speaker, the most recent year for which IRS data is available, 279,000 federal employees owed $3.4 billion in federal taxes, and the Joint Committee on Taxation estimates that enacting this legislation would increase revenues by $24 million over the 2012-2022 period. Mr. Speaker, $24 million may seem like a small figure to some inside the Beltway. However, I believe that any savings Congress can produce in today's fiscal environment is significant. This is a common-sense solution which received bipartisan support in the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. Similar legislation also received overwhelming support in the Senate. I urge passage of this bill, and I yield back my time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from Utah reserves the balance of his time. Gentlewoman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, as a member of the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform, I am pleased to join my colleagues in the consideration of H.R. 4365, a bill to amend Title V of the United States Code to make clear that accounts in the Thrift Savings Fund are subject to federal tax levies. Current law authorizes the Internal Revenue Service to levy private sector 401k retirement plans in order to collect unpaid federal taxes. However, due to an existing ambiguity between the Internal Revenue Code and the authorizing statute for the Federal Thrift Savings Plan, the IRS is unable to garnish TSP accounts to recover unpaid taxes from federal employees and members of Congress. In light of this statutory confusion, the Thrift Savings Plan's Executive Director, requested clarification from our committee back in July of 2011 as to whether the TSP should honor federal levies on TSP fund accounts. H.R. 4365 would simply ensure that federal TSP accounts and private sector 401k plans receive equal treatment in the area of tax administration and enforcement by amending the TSP authorizing statute to make clear that TSP fund accounts are in fact subject to federal tax levies by the IRS. In addition, pursuant to an amendment offered by our distinguished ranking member, Mr. Cummings of Maryland, and included in the bill as reported by our committee, any potential revenue derived from the enactment of H.R. 4365 may be used only for the purpose of deficit reduction. In supporting this bill, I would note that the vast majority of our public servants pay their taxes in a responsible and timely manner. In fact, according to the most recent IRS statistics, the tax delinquency rate among federal employees in 2010 was 3.33%, far lower than that of the general public. Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this reasonable legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Utah?
Mr. Speaker, I have no additional speakers. I will continue to reserve. But
Gentleman from New York?
I have no additional speakers. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Utah?
Mr. Speaker, it's a good common sense piece of legislation. I urge its adoption and yield back.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 4365? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rule...
Mr. Speaker, I object to the vote on the grounds that a quorum is not present and make a point of order that a quorum is not present, and I request the yeas and nays.
Yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking this vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. Sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20. The Chair's prior announcement further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. This gentlelady, no quorum?
Yes, I do.
Does the gentleman from Utah seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass Senate Bill 300 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
Senate 300, an act to prevent abuse of government charge cards.
Clerk will report the title. Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Shavitz, and the gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Maloney, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consent.
The gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials for the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Senate Bill 300 puts common sense controls under the users of government charge cards, which allows federal workers to purchase goods and travel in a timely and a cost-efficient manner. In any economy, but especially the one we are in now, there is no room for waste, much less fraud and abuse. These safeguards will make all users of federal charge cards accountable for their use. While the use of charge cards has saved the federal government both time and money when compared to a paper reimbursement system, some federal employees have abused their privilege and travel card privileges, resulting in unnecessary and sometimes fraudulent expenses. Numerous GAO reports over the last decade have called for additional controls to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse in the government charge card program. In 2008, GAO estimated that nearly 41% of purchase card transactions failed to meet basic internal control standards. Senator Grassley has put the spotlight on the problematic use of government charge cards for more than a decade, and the GAO has documented fraudulent purchases made by federal workers with these cards, including jewelry, gambling, cruises, and even a tab at a gentleman's club. Government charge cards were used to pay for the infamous GSA 2010 Western Regional Conference. The Oversight Committee was able to work on a bipartisan basis with the Armed Services Committee to bring Senator Grassley's bill, Senate Bill 300, to the floor today. The bill brings needed accountability to the process by which federal government manages charge cards used by federal employees. Senate Bill 300 requires agencies to improve their internal controls for government charge cards. It is based largely on the GAO's recommendations for preventing waste, fraud, and abuse. The additional safeguards resulting from the bill will avoid the waste of millions of dollars taxpayer money on fraudulent or questionable purchases. The controls will also help ensure that the federal government benefits from rebates available from charge card vendors for prompt payment. Senate Bill 300 requires agency inspectors general to periodically conduct risk assessments and perform audits to identify potential abuse of government charge cards. The bill also requires agencies to take appropriate disciplinary action, including removal, for federal employees who misuse charge cards. This provision responds to the GAO investigation that found inconsistent or non-existent consequences for federal employees who abuse these charge card privileges. I will be placing into the record a jurisdictional exchange of letters between the Committee on Armed Services and the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. With that, Mr. Speaker, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
The serious fiscal challenges facing the federal government demand that agencies do everything they can to operate as efficiently as possible. The federal government spends billions annually through its purchase card programs, using purchase cards and convenience checks to acquire millions of items, everything from paper and pencils to computers, and to make payments on government contracts for a variety of goods and services, such as vehicles and relocation services. The primary responsibility for purchasing these items rests with cardholders and the officials who approve their purchases. Because of the position of public trust held by federal employees, Congress and the American people expect cardholders and approving officials to maintain stewardship over the federal funds at their disposal. Specifically, purchase card holders and approving officials are expected to follow published acquisition requirements and exercise a standard of care in acquiring goods and services that is necessary and reasonable for the proper operation of an agency. Because every federal dollar that is spent on fraudulent, improper, and abusive purchases is a dollar that cannot be used for necessary government goods and services, ensuring that purchase cards are used responsibly is of particular concern at a time when the United States is experiencing substantial fiscal challenges. I strongly support Senator Grassley's bill, on which he has worked many years, S-300, because the legislation will require agencies to establish internal control activities over travel and charge cards. Agencies will be able to perform credit checks on potential recipients of travel cards. Agencies will also be able to appropriately discipline employees who misuse charge cards, including termination of their employment. Most importantly, this legislation will keep agencies accountable for charge card misuse, because the inspectors general of each agency will be required to examine charge card use twice a year and report any violations to the Office of Management and Budget. I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Utah.
I have no additional speakers. I'm prepared to yield back.
I have no additional speakers. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from Utah.
I appreciate the great work Senator Grassley has done on this bill. I urge its adoption. I think we can do so in a bipartisan way, and urge a yes vote. Yield back.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass Senate 300 as amended? Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentlewoman from New York.
I object to the vote on the grounds that a quorum is not present, and make a point of order that a quorum is not present.
Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20 and the Chair's prior announcement, further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. The gentleman from Utah seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 828 as amended.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 828, a bill to amend Title V United States Code to provide that persons having seriously delinquent tax debts shall be ineligible for federal employment.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Utah, Mr. Chaffetz, and the gentlewoman from New York, Mrs. Maloney, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials under the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Most every federal employee that I have run into, they're good, hard-working, patriotic people trying to do the right thing. But unfortunately, we have a few that really aren't doing the right thing. And I want to highlight a problem that we see out there. And while there are those federal employees that are delinquent on their federal taxes. Now, this becomes egregious, I think, because of the nature of their employment. They're working for the federal government, they're being paid by the federal taxpayers, and yet they're not paying their own federal taxes. Unfortunately, over the course of time, the situation has not gotten better. There are people that are dealing with very difficult situations. They have adopted something, or somehow in their life they've gotten upside down. The nature and the spirit of this bill, a bill that I'm the chief sponsor on, is to find those people who are trying to do the right thing. They're trying to rectify it. They're trying to come up with a plan. We're not going after those people. But for the other group of people who are just totally ignoring the law and they're not living up to their obligation, they're not paying their federal taxes, there ought to be more of a consequence. The number of delinquent federal tax employees has remained fairly consistent since the year 2004. Remarkably, there were 102,794 employees who were delinquent with their federal taxes back in 2004. Fast forward to 2010, that number is still 98,291. In fact, nearly 700 people on Capitol Hill are delinquent on their federal taxes. Unfortunately, the dollar amount of these delinquencies from 2004, which was $599.8 million, has grown to over $1 billion. In fact, it's $1.034 billion, unpaid taxes from federal employees. So employees who consciously ignore the channels and processes in place to fulfill their tax obligations must be held accountable. The Federal Employee Tax Accountability Act addresses noncompliance with our tax laws by prohibiting individuals with serious delinquent tax debt from federal civilian employment. This should be common sense and I hope is bipartisan. Most taxpayers, including government employees, file accurate tax returns and pay their taxes they owe on time, regardless of their income. Federal employees and individuals applying for federal employment should do the same, always. In 2010, the most recent year for which the IRS data is available, more than 98,000 civilian federal employees owed more than $1 billion in taxes. The average delinquency rate for federal civilian employees was 3.33%, up from 2.29% in 2008. The vast majority of federal workers who owe taxes owe them from income that they earn. The intent of this bill is simple. If you're a federal employee or an applicant for federal employment, you should be making a good faith effort to pay your taxes or to dispute them, as taxpayers have the right to do. Under this bill, H.R. 828, individuals having serious delinquent tax debts are ineligible for federal civilian employment in the executive and legislative branch. Quote, serious tax delinquent, end quote, is defined as an outstanding federal debt for which the notice of lien has been filed publicly. H.R. 828 exempt employees who are working to settle tax liabilities by excluding federal tax debts that are being paid in accordance with installment agreements or compromise or wage garnishment, for which due process hearing or request for relief from joint and several liability is requested or pending, or for which relief has been granted. So there are exceptions. We're not trying to cut somebody off at the knees if they're trying to do the right thing. The bill requires individuals applying for federal jobs to certify that they are not serious delinquent in their taxes. Agencies will also conduct periodic reviews of public records for tax liens. And individuals with serious delinquent tax debt may avail themselves to existing due process rights, including before the Merit Systems Protection Board. In addition, individuals will have 6 months to demonstrate that their tax debt is not, quote, seriously delinquent, end quote. The bill also provides a financial hardship exemption for federal employees. Federal employees are called to account for paying their taxes by the Code of Ethics in the executive branch. The Code of Ethics dictates that federal employees, quote, must satisfy in good faith their obligations as citizens, including all just financial obligations, especially those such as federal, state, or local taxes that are imposed by law, end quote. Thus, the necessity of this situation is unfortunately, it's getting worse. It's not getting better. We have an obligation, I think, to the American taxpayers and to the overwhelming majority, the 96+% of the federal workers who are doing the right thing. And thus, I urge the adoption of this bill. With that, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, as Chairman Issa has stated during the Oversight Committee's consideration of this bill, H.R. 828, he said this is largely a symbolic gesture. We all agree that everyone, including federal workers, should pay their taxes. Members on both sides of the aisle emphasize the need to hold federal employees accountable for tax obligations. However, the overwhelming majority of federal workers take their income tax obligations seriously. The tax compliance rate for federal employees is much higher than for the American public. According to the most recent statistics from the Internal Revenue Service, more than 96% of federal workers paid their taxes on time and do not owe money to the government. In addition, there are already existing laws and regulations that address tax debts owed by federal employees. And the IRS has a system in place for levying up to 15% of federal wage payments made to delinquent taxpayers until the tax debt is satisfied. The Joint Committee on Taxation has concluded that H.R. 828 would have negligible impact on revenue. In fact, implementation of the bill would have a small cost. So I'm not certain that this bill will have any significant impact whatsoever. I strongly believe that the House's efforts and energy would be better spent on focusing on measures to strengthen the federal civil service and improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the federal government, rather than by making symbolic gestures that reinforce a negative view of the federal workforce. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves the balance of her time. Gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
There is a need for this. I wish there wasn't a need for this. There are other more pressing things that we should be focused on. But this is $1 billion in uncollected taxes, taxes that are due by federal workers. And again, I don't want to disparage the reputation of all federal employees, but this small group of them, in excess now of 3% of our federal workers, is put in tarnishment on those other employees. I want to point to a January 23, 2012 Federal Eye article. Ed O'Keefe is the author. Let me read a paragraph from his article. He said, quote, "But on Capitol Hill, 684 employees, or almost 4% of the 18,000 congressional staffers, owed taxes in 2010, a jump of 46 workers from 2009. 4% of House staffers owed $8.5 million, and 3% of Senate employees owed $2.1 million, the IRS said." Indeed, we actually get a report from the IRS, and has a breakdown of the number of employees by department by which people aren't paying their federal taxes. The Department of Treasury, they have one of the lowest percentages. Less than 1% of their employees don't pay their taxes, but you still have 1,181 employees at the Department of Treasury who aren't paying it. There's an uncollected $9.3 million. At the Federal Reserve, the Board of Governors, smaller in terms of their numbers, but you still had 91 employees at the Federal Reserve not paying their taxes. 4.86% of their employees not paying over $1.2 million in taxes. As you go on a look at there, this one is my personal favorite. The U.S. Office of Government Ethics has the worst compliance rate of our federal workers. You put that on a movie, I wouldn't believe it, but nearly 6.5% of their employees don't pay their federal taxes, the U.S. Department of Government Ethics. Unfortunately, there is a need for this. I would like to highlight, we did this in a very bipartisan way within committee. There was an amendment offered by Mr. Lynch of Massachusetts, who I have the greatest respect for. He offered an amendment. We accepted that. When we accepted that, he was quoted as saying, and I quote from Mr. Lynch, "Without refinement here, a friendly amendment, I certainly would vote for the bill if the amendment were included," end quote. I hope we can do this in a bipartisan way. We have an obligation and duty to do this. I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I have no additional speakers, and I'm prepared to yield back the balance of my time.
Mr. Speaker, let me say in conclusion here.
Does the gentlewoman yield back the balance of her time?
I yield back the balance of my
Gentlewoman
time.
yields back the balance of her time. Gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Speaker, in conclusion, I just said, look, if federal workers aren't paying their federal taxes, they should be fired. If they're not paying their federal taxes and they want employment here, they should not be employed as federal workers. We have a duty and an obligation. This is a billion-dollar problem that needs in search of a solution. This is the solution. We should do so in a bipartisan way. And with that, I urge the adoption of this bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 828? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative, the rules are suspended.
Mr. Speaker,
Gentleman from Utah.
I'd ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring taking a vote by the yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. Sufficient number having arisen. The yeas and nays are ordered pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20 and the Chair's prior announcement. Further proceedings on this motion will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and concur in the Senate amendment to the bill H.R. 1627.
Clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1627, an act to amend Title 38 United States Code to provide for certain requirements for the placement of monuments in Arlington National Cemetery and for other purposes. Senate amendments.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Miller, and the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Michoud, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members would have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and add any extraneous material on the bill under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I might consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much. And as the chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, I rise in support of the Senate amendment to H.R. 1627. This is a comprehensive, bipartisan, bicameral legislative package to provide for the needs of veterans, their families, and survivors through improved health care, housing, education, and memorial services. In addition, the Senate amendment to H.R. 1627 would improve the accountability and transparency of the Department of Veterans Affairs, ensuring that VA is responsible to those it serves, our American veterans. As the title of this bill implies, this legislation would authorize VA health care services for veterans and their families for certain illnesses that manifested as a result of exposure to water contamination at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, during a 30-year span that ended in 1987. I want to specifically acknowledge the efforts of retired Marine Master Sergeant Jerry Ensminger, whose dogged efforts to seek answers from the government and justice for the victims of the water contamination inspired this bill. In honor of Jerry's daughter, Janie, who died of leukemia at the age of 9 after time spent at Camp Lejeune when the water was contaminated, Title I of this bill bears her name. Finally, I thank Representative Brad Miller and Senator Richard Burr, the original sponsors of the Camp Lejeune legislation in the House and the Senate, for their leadership. And although this legislation represents a hard-fought victory, we must not forget those who are no longer with us to see it become a law. I think when Senator Burr said this, he said it best. Unfortunately, many who are exposed have died as a result and are not here to receive the care this bill can provide. While I wish we could have accomplished this years ago, we now have the opportunity to do the right thing for thousands who were harmed during their service to our country." End quote. And I couldn't agree more. In addition to the veterans of Camp Lejeune, Section 106 of this bill contains legislation that Chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Health, Ms. Burkle, introduced, H.R. 2074, the Veteran Sexual Assault Prevention Act. The section and her bill, which passed the House last year, would address the serious failure of the Department of Veterans Affairs to prevent and report sexual assault incidents and corresponding flaws in the security of their facilities. It creates a fundamentally safer environment for our veterans and VA employees by requiring an accountable and comprehensive oversight system. I want to express my personal appreciation to Ms. Buerkle for her advocacy on behalf of women and all of our veterans. In just 2 short years, she has proven herself to be a committed and strong voice for service members and veterans, not only in the state of New York, but across this country. Her considerable expertise as a nurse, a lawyer, and mother of 6 was the reason I chose her to be the chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Health. And I can tell you that in the role that she has played, she has never wavered from doing what is right for all of our veterans. The bill also includes several worthy legislative proposals to improve health care services brought forth from our members on both sides of the aisles and in both chambers, the House and in the Senate. This bill also addresses several other areas where we will be able to expand and improve health care for veterans. It would allow for greater flexibility in VA payments to state veteran homes, break down barriers to care for veterans with traumatic brain injury, clarify the access rights of service dogs on VA property, and improve care for rural, elderly, and homeless veterans. This bill also addresses several important matters related to veterans' housing. Because many of our returning wounded warriors need assistance modifying their residences to meet their needs, this bill would reauthorize and expand several provisions relating to the Specially Adaptive Housing Grant Program. These grants provide funding to eligible disabled veterans and service members to adapt homes that they own or homes that they are currently living in to meet their daily needs. Adaptations can include grab bars in bathrooms, widening doorways for wheelchairs, or constructing a wheelchair ramp. Now, these grants are imperative to affording veterans the level of independent living that they were accustomed to prior to their injury and that they may not be able to otherwise enjoy. As many of us are aware, far too many of our veterans have found themselves on hard times and are homeless and are at risk for homelessness. To combat this problem, this bill would authorize funding for additional housing options for homeless veterans to help them gain stability and obtain access to other treatment that services that they may need from VA. The next area of the bill would be in addressing education. We all know that we have provided a very generous benefit to the veterans in the post-9/11 GI Bill. The problem is that we have never really tracked the performance of the bill or if the benefits are effective in training veterans to be leaders of tomorrow. Therefore, this legislation would increase our oversight of post-9/11 educational benefits by requiring annual reports to Congress on the effectiveness of these benefits and how they're being utilized. And I want to thank my friend and Congressman Gus Bilirakis for introducing this provision in H.R. 2274 and for his leadership on improving transparency for the post-9/11 GI Bill. Another critical area addressed by this legislation is that of veteran benefits. Over the last 3 years, we've seen the disability claims backlog grow exponentially, with more than 900,000 claims now awaiting decisions. 50% of those have been pending for a period of 125 days or more. Despite repeated promises from VA to break the backlog, it continues to grow. Therefore, the provision of this bill that addresses benefit matters will assist in processing claims more efficiently. First, it would allow veterans to automatically waive regional office review of evidence submitted directly to the Board of Veterans' Appeals for claims in appellate status. Second, it would allow veterans in need of assistance with claims to have a signatory on their behalf assist them with the claims process. And third, it would modernize VA statutory duty to assist by authorizing electronic communications, potentially saving weeks in a claims processing times. Fourth, to alleviate the burdens of redundant paperwork, veterans would now be able to file jointly for Social Security and indemnity compensation. And finally, to promote accountability of individual claims processors, VA would be required to present a plan in 6 months on how it will take corrective action when their employees need training to do their jobs well. I want to thank my friend Mr. Runyon from New Jersey, the chairman of the Subcommittee on Disability Assistance and Memorial Affairs, for his dedication to our nation's veterans and his focus on advancing legislation such as H.R. 2349 that will achieve measurable results in alleviating the backlog of claims. And now, many of these provisions that I have discussed thus far have focused on our efforts to honor our commitment to the brave men and women who serve our nation, including those transitioning from the recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, we must also continue our commitment to our fallen heroes. Accordingly, this bill also sets out specific criteria that prohibits disruptions and protests of funerals of members of the armed forces at VA national cemeteries and at Arlington National Cemetery, including the imposition of criminal and civil liability for violations of these restrictions. In addition, given the sacred nature of Arlington National Cemetery, a name synonymous with honoring American freedom, this legislation would codify a prohibition on the reservation of grave sites at Arlington National Cemetery with very limited exceptions. I worked closely with Mr. Runyon on this prohibition to ensure that many future generations of American heroes will be buried and honored at Arlington National Cemetery. And I want to thank him again for his leadership on this issue and for originally introducing H.R. 1484. Similarly, I introduced the original measure on H.R. 1627, which would place restrictions on the type and placement of monuments at Arlington National Cemetery due to the fact that the cemetery itself is a monument. Arlington National Cemetery is a unique national treasure. It is for this reason that this legislation is necessary to ensure that the integrity of the cemetery is preserved, both in its utilization of land with the placement of monuments and with its allocation of grave sites. Finally, this comprehensive package also contains several miscellaneous provisions affecting our nation's veterans. And although these areas may not receive as much attention, such as health care or benefits, they are no less important to improving the lives of the veterans of this country. I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Filner, as well as the chairman and ranking member of the Senate Committee on Veterans Affairs, Senator Murray and Senator Burr, for their insight and cooperation on advancing this bill, this compromised bill today. So I want to reiterate that this bill is paid for both in its mandatory and discretionary costs via offsets that have been used many times by this committee and historically has been supported by both sides of the aisle. And finally, Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to insert a joint explanatory statement for the Honoring America's Veterans in Caring for Camp Lejeune Families Act of 2012 into the record, as well as a floor colloquy between myself and the gentleman from Maine, Mr. Michaud.
Objection.
I appreciate that, Mr. Speaker, and once again I thank all the members of the committee, the staff of the House and the Senate on Veterans Affairs for their work on this bill, and I urge all members to support Senate Amendment to H.R. 1627. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman recognized.
I rise today in strong support of H.R. 1627 as amended, the Honoring Americans Veterans and Caring for Camp Lejeune Family Act of 2012. This bill represents the hard work of both chambers and both sides of the aisle. I want to thank Chairman Miller and Ranking Member Filner, as well as Senator Murray and Senator Burr, and all of my colleagues on the Veterans Affairs Committee in both chambers for all the work that went into crafting this legislation. This bill provides health care benefits to veterans and family members who have suffered illnesses due to exposure to harmful chemicals through drinking contaminated water while stationed at Camp Lejeune, North Carolina. This bill also provides important improvements to enable the VA to better care for veterans living in rural areas. These veterans constitute 40% of the veterans who seek care at VA. These improvements include waiving the collection of co-payments for veterans who use telehealth or telemedicine services, authorizing VA to pay for travel benefits to veterans seeking care at vet centers, requiring VA to establish and operate centers of excellence for rural health research, education, and clinical activities, and finally, requiring VA to create a system of consultation and assessment of mental health, traumatic brain injury, and other conditions through teleconsultation. A provision I'm particularly proud of will improve the care to provide for our elderly veterans, those that are 70% disabled or higher in our state veterans nursing homes. This bill makes improvements in the areas of veterans benefits and claim process. One such improvement, a provision based on a measure introduced by Ranking Member Filner, enables a veteran or family member on an appeal to waive the current requirement that new evidence be first considered by the VA. This provision would enable the Board of Veterans' Appeals to review evidence submitted directly to it instead of waiting for redecision at the agency level. This bill includes important housing provisions as well. One provision would help veterans with vision impairment and veterans residing temporarily in housing owned by a family member by aligning VA's definition of blindness with a definition of blindness under existing federal law. This bill also provides the amount made available to veterans who receive a temporary resident adaptation grant are not counted against the maximum allowable under the Specialty Adapted Housing Program. Also, this bill makes permanent the authority of the VA to guarantee adjustable rate and hybrid rate mortgages. Mr. Speaker, I've only highlighted a few of the important parts of this bill that were found in H.R. 1627 as amended, and I would encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this very important veterans measure. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to yield as much time as she might consume to Chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Health, Ms. Burkle of New York.
Gentlelady is recognized for such time as she may consume.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of the Senate amendment to H.R. 1627, the Honoring America's Veterans and Caring for Camp Lejeune Families Act of 2012. Included in this bill are provisions that reflect the oversight work of the Subcommittee on Health, of which I am honored to chair. Central to the health care portion of this legislation is Section 106, which would require the Department of Veterans Affairs to develop and implement a comprehensive policy on the prevention, monitoring, reporting, and tracking of sexual assaults and other safety incidents that occur at VA medical facilities. This provision was originally passed in the House last year in H.R. 2074 as amended, the Veterans Sexual Assault Prevention Act. I introduced this measure last year in response to a disturbing GAO report which found that between 2007 and 2010, some 284 instances of alleged sexual assault occurred in VA medical facilities around the country. As a former registered nurse and domestic violence counselor, I am all too familiar with the corrosive and harmful effect sexual and physical violence can have in the lives of its victims. Abusive behavior like the kind documented by the GAO is unacceptable, and for it to be found in what should be an environment of healing for our honored veterans is simply unforgivable. This bill would establish and enforce critically important actions to correct the serious safety vulnerabilities, security problems, and oversight failures by VA leadership that threatens the safety of veterans seeking care through the Department and the hard-working employees who provide that care. I am confident that the comprehensive requirements mandated in this bill would resolve the deficiencies GAO uncovered and ensure that the VA healthcare system is a safe and secure place for our veterans and their families to seek care. I have been working furiously since last October when this provision first passed the House to get it through the Senate and signed into law by the President. I am very pleased and relieved that the day has finally come and not a moment too soon for those who need it. However, my oversight does not stop at the President's desk. With this statement, I am putting VA on notice that I will remain vigilant in ensuring that the legislation is implemented swiftly and as intended to protect veterans and employees at VA medical facilities. Also included in this bill, Mr. Speaker, is a measure that would allow for greater flexibility in establishing rates for reimbursements to state homes for nursing home care provided to certain service-connected veterans. This proposal was also included in H.R. 2074. I want to thank the gentleman from Maine and the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Health for his very hard work in introducing this provision and the manner in which he continues to embody a true bipartisan spirit to advance legislation for the benefit of our veterans as well as their families. Additionally, the bill includes a measure to expand the ability of worthy, not-profit entities to obtain grants to provide services for homeless veterans. Our colleague from the state of Washington, Dave Reichert, has been a strong advocate for establishing these important enhancements, and I am pleased that this provision he introduced is included in the bill. I am pleased that this provision, for which he has been a strong advocate, has been included. There are so many other important provisions included: improving rehabilitative care to veterans with traumatic brain injury, waiving the collection of co-payments for telehealth and telemedicine, establishing an initiative to expand beneficiary travel reimbursements to veterans, clarifying the access rights of service dogs on VA property and in VA facilities, and providing medical care for certain veterans and their families who are exposed to contaminated water at Camp Lejeune. It has been an honor for me, Mr. Speaker, to work with my colleagues in the House and the Senate on this legislation. In particular, I am grateful for the hard work as well as the leadership of our chairman, Mr. Miller from Florida. Mr. Speaker, I urge all of my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation. I have no further comments, and I yield back my time to the chair. Thank you.
Gentleman from Maine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Dingell.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 5 minutes. Thank you, Michael.